Yeah, a little too inexperienced.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Bonjour, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, boys and girls, members of the cadet organization who are also helping us today. On behalf of the Robert Hampton Gray Monument Project team, led by retired Captain Terry Milne here, with Lieutenant Colonel Stanley Brigadier, myself, and retired Master Sailor Joe Boskowski, along with the co-host, the BC Aviation Museum, led by Mr. David Jackson here. I am retired Lieutenant Commander Gerald Pash. It's my privilege, indeed, to be your Director of Ceremonies on the traditional territory of the Secum, Sartslip, and Pocrotchin nations of the Coast Salish people, who were here tens of thousands of years before the Europeans arrived and this was ever an airport. So on May 8th last year, the world marked the 75th anniversary of the end of the Second World War in Europe. 3 months later, on August 14th, we mark the end of the war in the Pacific. Today's event commemorates the accomplishments of the Canadians who served with the Royal Navy Fleet Air Arm during the Second World War, and particularly the heroism of the last Canadian, the only member of the Royal Canadian Navy and British Columbian pilot to be awarded the Victoria Cross for his actions 76 years ago, just days before the Pacific War ended. Lieutenant Gray's Victoria Cross was said to symbolically recognize the accomplishments of the 42 Canadians who died while serving with the Royal Navy Fleet Air Arm. Please remain standing for the national anthems, Ki Magayo of the State of Japan, followed by O Canada. You may sit down, thank you. Now we're going to unveil this wonderful monument that we had planned to make this happen a year ago on August 9th, which would have been the 75th anniversary of Hamilton Gray's heroic action. But of course, we all know how life got in the way of all of us here. So we're going to unveil it in 3 parts: the center panel, the right panel, and the left panel. Originally, Mr. Hattori was going to assist with the center panel, but in his place, I would ask the Commander of Maritime Forces Pacific, the Honorable Mary Collins, and Ms. Martin to come up here to unveil the center panel. Just pull it up from the bottom and allow it to fall behind. Ms. Martin and Admiral, you go ahead. Just let it fall behind. Thank you very much. You may return to your place. The right-hand panel will be uncovered by retired Captain Terry Milne and Ms. Dr. Ann George. And the left-hand panel by Lieutenant General Meinzerger, Commander RCAF, and Mr. David Jackson, President of the BC Aviation Museum. Ladies and gentlemen, the monument to Robert Hampton Gray and the 260 Canadians who served with the Royal Navy Fleet Air Arm 42 who were perished. You see peeking over the top at the back of the monument there's a wall of 47 stainless steel maple leaves. The large leaves represent the 5 aircraft carriers of the Royal Navy Pacific Fleet. Of the 260 Canadian naval aviators who served with the Royal Navy Fleet Air Arm during the Second World War, 42 perished. They are represented by the small leaves. There are some flowers and poppies, of course, that you may wish to place amongst the maple leaves at the back of the monument later after the ceremony. Reverend Gates will now dedicate the monument with words of dedication and a prayer of blessing. You may remove your headdress as is your will.
In the faith of Jesus Christ, and for the benefit of all who pass this way, we offer and dedicate this memorial to the glory of God and in memory of Robert Hampton Gray. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Father.
Nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun, and in the morning, we will remember them. We will remember them.
To read High Flight, a poem written by an American who served with the RAF, Pilot Officer John Gillespie McGee.
Oh, I have slipped the surly bonds of earth, and danced the skies on laughter-silvered wings. Sunward I climbed, and joined the tumbling mirth of sun-split clouds, and done 100 things you not have dreamed of.
Dr. Ann George, niece to Robert Hampton Gray, accompanied by his great and great-great-nieces, will together place a wreath in front of the monument. Absolutely delighted to have the descendants of Robert Hampton Gray with us today, ladies and gentlemen. Is Mr. Jeremy Brownridge, Private Secretary to Her Honor and Executive Director of Government House.
Again, as Jerry said, Her Honor sends her warmest wishes to everybody and sincere regrets that she couldn't join you here today. But as Lieutenant Governor and as Honorary Captain of the HMCS Malahat, she's asked that I read a message on her behalf. As Lieutenant Governor of British Columbia and Honorary Captain of HMCS Malahat, it is my great honor to mark the unveiling of a memorial for Lieutenant Robert Hampton Gray, a most remarkable British Columbian whose service to our country is extremely worth commemoration here today. Lieutenant Gray was the only member of the Royal Canadian Navy to have been recognized with this highest honor, the Victoria Cross. It's particularly
Here's Mr. Adam Olson, MLA for Saanich North and the Islands. Mr. Olson is also a member of the Sartlip First Nation that occupied these lands, as I said, thousands of years before it was an airport.
Michael Cheel, good morning. It is an honor to be here this morning to represent my colleagues, the elected representatives of the British Columbia Legislature.
We're grateful to Veterans Affairs Canada that has provided significant funds toward the monument and support for today's ceremony. The Honourable Lawrence Macaulay, Minister of Veterans Affairs, expressed his regret at not being here today. In his place, please welcome Ms. Beverly Martin, Veterans Affairs Canada Area Director for British Columbia and the North.
I wish to respectfully acknowledge the tremendous sacrifices of the brave Canadians who served our country so selflessly, in particular Lieutenant Robert Hampton Gray and his fellow Canadian pilots whom we honor here today. Lieutenant Gray was a naval officer and pilot and a true Canadian hero. He was one of only 2 members of the Royal Navy's Fleet Air Arm to receive the Victoria Cross during the Second World War, and the last Canadian to be awarded the Victoria Cross.
7 aviators are among the Canadians awarded the Victoria Cross. 3 during the First World War, serving with units of the United Kingdom. 4 during the Second World War, 1 serving with the Royal Air Force, 2 with the RCF, and Lieutenant Gray of the Royal Canadian Navy Volunteer Reserve, loaned to the Royal Navy Fleet Air Arm. Today, the RCAF provides air support to all elements of the Canadian Armed Forces. We're very appreciative today and honored to have the Commander of the Royal Canadian Air Force present, the privilege to introduce Lieutenant General Alexander Meinzinger.
Last year I was very pleased and honored to be a part of the Parks Canada video honoring Lieutenant Robert Hampton Gray, as you know, often referred to as Hammy. And I think every great aircrew member has a cool call sign, and that certainly is one of them. The video that was created recognized Lieutenant Gray's military accomplishments by naming him one of the Parks Canada hometown heroes. And Parks Canada dedicated a plaque at that moment in his honor. And this plaque, I'm sure Angus knows very well, will be installed on the 6th Royal Canadian Navy Arctic Offshore Patrol Ship that bears Hammy's name, the HMCS Robert Hampton Gray. Lieutenant Gray joined the Royal Canadian Navy Volunteer Reserves in 1940 and served as a pilot in the Royal Navy Fleet Air Arm until his death in the Battle of August 9, 1945. A day under heavy enemy attack, his aircraft already on fire. He carried the day, he pressed forward, and he scored a direct hit on the vessel that he was attacking. Right after he was hit, of course, his aircraft crashed into the water and he did not survive, paying the ultimate sacrifice. It bears noting that Lieutenant Gray was the only member, as noted, of the RCN to be awarded the Victoria Cross during World War II, and he was also awarded a Distinguished Service Cross. There are monuments, in fact, across Canada, including one in Hamilton, Kingston, and Ottawa, and I understand there's also a mountain in British Columbia within the Kokanee Glacier Provincial Park that's dedicated to him and his brother John, who of course was also lost during the war.
Canada's naval contribution in the Pacific Theater during the Second World War is not as well known as the Battle of the Atlantic and the Battle of St. Lawrence, where the Royal Canadian Navy was tasked to protect the sea lanes to Europe. But markedly, the Royal Canadian Navy took part in the 1942 Alertion Campaign, and HMCS Uganda joined the Royal Navy Pacific Fleet in 1945 with a mostly Canadian crew, augmented with members of the Royal Navy, such as was the case for many Royal Navy ships that had Canadians amongst the ship's companies, particularly the aircraft carriers in which Lieutenant Gray served. The commander of the Royal Canadian Navy, Vice Admiral Craig Baines, regrets he's not able to be here today, but is delighted to introduce the commander of Maritime Forces Pacific, Rear Admiral Angus Topshee.
Heartening to be here on a day like today to celebrate a great Canadian, a great British Columbian, and a great member of the Royal Canadian Navy. And I think my function speaking today is to remind the Commander of the Air Force that in fact Robert Hampton Gray was in the Navy and the Fleet Air Arm at the time of all of these accidents.
The next speaker has been engaged in projects to honor Robert Hampton Gray since 1986. When as the Canadian Defense Attaché in Tokyo, the Canadian War Museum contacted him to determine if Lieutenant Gray's aircraft could be recovered for exhibit. The former Defense Attaché to Japan, retired Captain Navy Terry Mill.
You were one of a very small group of 4 to push this project through. Very small but very powerful. Stan Brigadier, Colonel Stan Brigadier, Lieutenant Commander Jerry Pash, and Master Seaman Joe Bukowski all put their most and their best into this project for several years. How did this happen? How did we come to produce this monument? Well, as you know, Hampton Gray's aircraft crashed into the bay on a Gower Bay, and his remains are still there, 76 years ago. Well, 36 years ago, we received a letter in the embassy in Tokyo from the National War Museum asking if we could conduct a search for Lieutenant Gray's Corsair aircraft. It took about a year to put together the necessary divers, 6 US Navy divers, 2 Canadian commercial divers, and about 3 dozen amateur Japanese divers. And what we found within 1 hour was a clutch of Allied bombs sitting on the bottom of Onagawa Bay, with ships passing over them backwards and forwards daily for almost 40 years. The Japanese Coast Guard ordered us to stop the search, and eventually the Maritime Self-Defense Force sent in a team to countermine the bombs, and as a result of that, any little bits of aircraft that might have been left were just blown away and scattered. But the pilots, several of them who were flying with Hammy Gray on the day that he crashed, asked if we could put some sort of marker, some sort of cairn on the hill overlooking Onagawa Bay, so that Hampton Gray wouldn't be entirely forgotten. And I must say that when we did have the dedication ceremony for that monument, when we received this request from the pilots for some sort of marker, it was with some trepidation that I approached the mayor of Onagawa Bay. 149 Japanese citizens were killed during the Allied air offensive. So I wasn't too sure what sort of a reception I would get when I asked the mayor. But he was indeed a wonderful man. He was a humanist, he was kind, he was understanding, and he also felt that it would be best for his city to have a moment of reconciliation. Today, on the front of your program, you will see the words written by Mayor Zenjiro Shuda in response to our request for a monument. And as the General said, it was, and I think probably still is, the only monument to a foreign enemy, a former foreign enemy in all of Japan. You then have to shift forward about 15, 20 years, and at that time, former Master Seaman Joe Mikowski, who was there handing out poppies when you arrived, came to see me and asked if it was possible to build a monument in Canada. He said, you know, it's great that we've got the monument in Japan, and every time ships go to Japan, Navy ships, Canadian Navy ships, they visit the monument and conduct a ceremony in memory. That's great, but Joe, said, what about Canadian youngsters? What about we want to just now express our appreciation for people who have contributed to the monument. There's a list of names on this granite bench, and that includes all those who made major contributions. Such people as Peter Keith Murray, who read High Flight to you, Stan Brigadier, Jerry Presley, a former Royal Roads cadet and former military college graduate, former voodoo pilot, former Olympic gold medal winner in the luge for Canada. All these people contributed heavily, and without them we would not have been able to proceed. But also 100 donors from across Canada donated funds to be able to build this monument. I want to mention that for those interested in the story of Hampton Gray, you can buy his biography in the gift shop. A noted landscape designer and his wife, who's also involved in landscape designing, and a public artist with many pieces of public art in civic communities here in Victoria, donated the design of the Wall of Honour behind here, and fortunately it was, because about the time that we finished the Wall of Honour we ran out of money. So we want to feel that we've expressed adequate appreciation to the British Columbia Museum, British Columbia Aviation Museum, without whom this would not be here. They kindly donated the space. They put up with all the work that had to go on. Fortunately, it was at the time of the pandemic, so it didn't disrupt too many of their people. But without them, this would not have happened. The Royal Canadian Legion donated twice.
Veterans Affairs Canada, of course, your tax dollars at work. $25,000 towards the monument. And the BC Aviation Museum, that celebrates so much of Canada's aviation history and the associated personalities, has accepted the care and custody of this monument. And tell you more about the Society's commitment to commemoration, I'm happy to introduce the President of the BC Aviation Museum, Mr. David Jackson.
Honored guests, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for coming. As an ex-army guy, I feel very outnumbered, but I can assure you that Canada does have an army. I do have three very brief points to make. One, to invite you into the museum at the conclusion of this ceremony to come and see us. We are an all-volunteer, not-for-profit organisation that is almost entirely self-funded. We do get great help from the Victoria Airport Authority and the District of North Saanich, and I'm not saying that just because they are here, but they are. If anybody does have $10 million in their pocket that they don't know what to do with, we will be glad to translate this into your name above our new hangar that we are hoping to build. Second point, to thank everybody who took part in this ceremony and made it possible. There are a lot of people who work behind the scenes to do all the work, to lay this all out, for the catering and everything else, and to recognise them and thank them very much for their efforts. Thank you all to the old gentlemen, the retired Navy gentlemen who made this monument possible. I must admit there were times when we did fight like hell about where should this monument be, how big should it be, what form should it take. But I think we have a lovely monument as a result, and to acknowledge all the hard work people did. And the last point I would make is slightly philosophical. There are many monuments around the world. I've been to some of them. Verdun, and Omaha Beach, the Menin Gate, Vimy Ridge. All these monuments contain the names of mostly young, mostly men who have given their lives for their country. I hope these days we can see a little bit beyond those names, to the people who took part in conflicts on both sides of the wars, to the families. They all had mothers and fathers and brothers and sisters, some had sons and daughters, and to those civilians that are also affected by war. So let's try and think of all those people who are affected by conflict, as well as commemorating those brave people that find themselves on these monuments. Thank you very much.
32 years ago, with the support of the people of Onagawa and the Japanese Veterans Association, a monument was dedicated to Lieutenant Gray and established at a site overlooking the bay where his remains lay for eternity, as you've heard today. The mayor of Onagawa, his Wirrap Jinjiro Suda, poignantly said, and it's on the cover of your program if you haven't read it, I'm going to offer it here today. By forgetting our past sentiments and feelings of rivalry, we must make our best efforts to enhance our ties of goodwill and friendship between Canada and Japan and to deepen exchanges and understanding between our two peoples. Paying our respects to the great Canadian naval hero, Lieutenant Gray, and erecting a monument to his memory is, I trust, a most relevant and really excellent thing for us to do. Now, created in 1929, Canada's diplomatic mission in Japan is the oldest post in Asia. It's also noteworthy that Japan established its consulate in Vancouver in 1889. In the same spirit of reconciled friendship, what a great privilege to welcome the Consul General of the State of Japan in Vancouver, Mr. Takashi Hattori.
Wow. Hello everyone. Being late for the appointment is a great biggest sin in Japan. But you may understand that it's because of Air Canada. Mr. Brownlee, I hope this monument will help to preserve the peace and understanding that exists between Japan and Canada today. Thank you.
It was mentioned that when a Canadian warship visits Japan, the ship's company usually seek out the monument in Onagawa. It's also interesting that when a ship of the Japanese Self-Defense Force visits Esquimalt, there is a Japanese sailor from the 2 centuries ago who is buried in God's Acres Cemetery, Veterans Cemetery in Esquimalt, and the ship's company of the Japanese warship company. 99 Canadians, or people closely associated with what became Canada in 1867, have been awarded the Victoria Cross. 7 prior to the First World War, 76 1914 to 1918, including our former Lieutenant Governor George Perks during the First World War, and 16 during the Second World War, 6 being posthumous. Robert Hampton Gray was the last Canadian to be awarded the decoration. Canada has its own Victoria Cross now, but it has yet to be awarded. So having a recipient in your family tree is really quite rare. Dr. Ann George, niece of Lieutenant Robert Hampton Gray, is here now to speak on behalf of the family.
Yeah, Hampton grew up in Nelson, BC, with his older sister Phyllis, who is my mother, and his younger brother Jack. They were a loving family. Their father John grew up in Brecon, Scotland, and served for 2 years in the Boer War before immigrating to Canada in 1905. John met Mina McAllister when he arrived in New Westminster, and they married. They moved to Trail, BC, where Hampton and Jack were born, and then to Nelson, where John owned the jewelry store that is still there on Baker Street today. The family was well liked, and John contributed throughout the community, serving on the city council, the hospital board, the Presbyterian church, the curling club, which he loved, and got involved in many other activities, including war efforts. With his strong, broad Scottish accent and generous spirit, everybody liked him. Hard times came on the Gray family during the 30s throughout the Depression, when there was nothing selling in a jewelry store for sure. Then came the 1940s, and Jack and Hampton did what many young men did across Canada. Jack joined the Air Force and Hampton the Navy. The brothers had opportunities to meet when they both served in the UK. After they met in London in 1941, Jack reported back to his parents about Hampton. He said, "Boy, am I sure proud of my brother. He has about 45 hours in the air now, but the real thing is to have a brother who is a pilot in the Fleet Air Arm. Those fellows have to be really good. They are training with the RAF station, so they are getting good training, you may be sure. He still has lots of work ahead of him before he gets his wings, but I'm sure he will." The next time they met, Jack was just as proud of him, but not about the flying. He told his parents that Hampton was so well paid, and so much better paid than him, that he was able to pick up the tab for beer, hotel, and dinner. The Commander Watts told Hampton's parents.
There's another funny little thing about the monument, and if you're a purist, okay, fine. You'll notice the Fleet Air Arm badge that Hammy's wearing there. It is the Fleet Air Arm badge that has the Victorian crown, which was the crown used on all military regalia up until 1952, when the Edwardian crown was adopted when Queen Elizabeth came to the throne. And the badge in the middle here is the contemporary Fleet Air Arm badge rather than the badge that Annie actually wore. So the issue was we couldn't find a decent photograph to cause the to be expanded and then engraved on the wall here. So we have come to the end. The Queen, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for being here.
Yes.